Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 82 years old now, and for the last 4 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Today our guest is Peniel Joseph. Peniel Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He is also a professor of history and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. His book is titled Freedom Season: How 1963 Transformed America's Civil Rights Revolution. I'm joined by 14 of my Harvard classmates. Why don't we start with Richard?
Well, hello. Richard Rothstein, an author, writer, class of 63. As I was saying, still standing. And looking forward to hearing from you. I apologize in advance. I might have to leave a bit early, and if I do, it won't reflect any lack of interest.
Okay, great. Ron?
Living in class of 63, living in Newton, Massachusetts. From a week after graduation, I've been working mostly in television and video and still doing it on a volunteer basis.
Okay, Doug?
Hi, Doug Shapiro. I'm currently living in Louisville, Kentucky, although I grew up in a highly segregated Houston, Texas, a long time ago. And I've had 3 careers. One was in clinical medicine, followed by a 20-year period in which I studied the behavior of coral reef fish, and finally ended up as the head of the biology department at Eastern Michigan University.
Okay, Bill Collins.
Bill Collins. I'm grew up in Boston, Harvard 63, like the rest of these guys. 20 years in the Navy, lived various places, served in 5 ships, and now in Aiken, South Carolina, where I came to work at the Savannah Riverside years ago. No longer working for dollars, volunteer work. My wife of 55 years is here with me, and our kids are elsewhere.
Okay. John?
Oh, hi. John Woodford, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I grew up in the segregated town of Benton Harbor, Michigan, but it's across the other side of the state. I've been here in Ann Arbor for a while, where I was editing and writing for the university. I also worked in the New York Times, and I was editor-in-chief of Muhammad Speaks newspaper for 4 years, from 68 to 72.
Okay, Alden?
Alden Briscoe, also class of 63, born in Mass General, grew up in New England, and have moved across the country and now live in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, Jeff?
Jeff Fox, also class of 63, born in Chicago, and I think we all know about how segregated that city was. And then after college, a lot of work in Latin America as a sociologist, and now I'm living in Spain and writing fiction.
Okay, David Hoffman?
Born in Medford, Massachusetts, but grew up in Guatemala, Rio, and then moved to Medellin, Colombia after graduate school, and worked there for a number of years.
Okay. Nick?
Nick Bancroft, same class, 63. After that, Harvard Business School, a stint in the Peace Corps in India with small business development, and then back to Boston for investments in finance and trusts and all that kind of good stuff.
Okay, and Hamp?
Hamp Howell, grew up in the segregated town of West Hampton Beach, New York, and then after Harvard, I lived in segregated Roxbury for 3 years, and was doing community organizing around the war war, and I've really appreciated your books, Peniel.
Thank you.
Okay, and Allison.
Yeah, I don't see myself, but that's, I guess, not a problem. Yeah, I'm name is Allison Wardle. I was in the class of 63 Radcliffe, and then Peace Corps in Turkey for 2 years, and then I got a master's at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. And shortly after, I moved to Italy and have been living here, vineyards and such, and not much else to report.
Okay. And Professor, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And
Oh, great. Thank you, Kent, for the invitation. A couple of folks I do know here, Richard Rothstein, who we've met. Jamie Galbraith is a good friend, and I've taught his work. And John Woodford, his work is instrumental. My book on the Black Power movement, which was my first book, and the stuff I've done on Malcolm X. And so I know about the editing of Muhammad Speaks, especially, which is hugely important. Um, so a little bit about myself. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in Brooklyn and Queens. I've been, this is my eighth book, this book, Freedom Season. And I've been just a student of the civil rights, Black Power periods for over 35 years. I'm the son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1966. My late mother was a hospital worker at Mount Sinai Hospital, SCIU 1199. And I was on my first picket line 45 years ago in New York City, outside of Mount Sinai Hospital in 1979. And so I grew up in a union household. My mother spoke four languages, Haitian, French, and Spanish and English, and was really somebody who connected a lot of different groups of people who were Jewish and Muslim and Russian speakers and people from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and Haiti together all around labor. So that's my background. In a lot of ways, didn't expect to become a professor, was on picket lines and demonstrations in New York and Brooklyn and Queens, all throughout the 1970s and 80s, um, before Black Lives Matter and before this current backlash too. So I grew up in New York's under Ed Koch, very segregated city, very racist city, but a family that read four or five newspapers every day, and that were really huge social justice advocates. My older brother is an ER physician. I do what I do, but our whole family was a very, very just political family in New York City. So we never had to discover that we were Black or that we were African and Caribbean. My mother drilled that in our heads. I grew up in a household where we had C.L.R. James as the Black Jacobins, and we read that when we were 9 and 10 years old. That's the household we grew up in. So Jamesian self-activity wasn't just an abstraction; it was what we lived every day. So it's really interesting to be here. Very, very briefly, and then we can get into a discussion. My latest book is a book called Freedom Season. And it's a book about 1963, where James Baldwin is one of the protagonists, but the Kennedys are here. William F. Buckley and Norman Podhoretz are here. Gloria Richardson, Lorraine Hansberry, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. And it really is a book that is a panoramic narrative history of just the year 1963. Starts in fall of 62. Kennedy's not assassinated until 370 pages into the book. It's about a 500-page book. And it really makes an argument that 1963 is the most important year of the 1960s. And that 63 ushers in a 50-year racial justice consensus between the president's June 11th speech all the way up until Shelby v. Holder in June of 2013, which ends Section 5 pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act and really thrusts us into a post-consensus America. So throughout that book, the main themes of Freedom Season are really the struggle for Black dignity and citizenship, multiracial democracy and freedom, and how many people are defining that and debating that and arguing with each other. The demonstrations, the murders of not just Medgar Evers and the president, but of the six children in Birmingham on September 15th, 1963, and what that does to the country. In a lot of ways, Baldwin, who I just got a Carnegie Fellowship, and I'm doing another book, which is sort of on Baldwin and what we mean by multiracial democracy. Um, Baldwin is a through line because The Fire Next Time comes out on January 31st, 1963. The larger essay, had come out in the November issue of the New Yorker in 1962 under the title A Letter from a Region in My Mind, which was a 20,000 word essay, Wallace Shawn's New Yorker. And then the essay to the nephew, which then becomes the inspiration for Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me, was published in The Progressive in 1962. And they take those two essays, they become The Fire Next Time. Letter from a Region in My Mind is going to be renamed Down the Cross. And what's so extraordinary about Baldwin is that Baldwin uh, sees the world in a very, very important and complex way. And I think The Fire Next Time is this hugely radical document, much more radical than people thought, both at the time and now, in the sense that he makes an argument for this grand aspirational republic that's committed to multiracial democracy, but gets to reunion through confrontation. You can only get through truth, justice, and reconciliation through confronting both the original sin of racial slavery, the afterlife of Jim Crow and racial terror and white supremacy, but also the big lies that racial slavery and the dehumanization of Black people are based upon, right? And so The Fire Next Time is a really, really interesting and important book that becomes the book to talk about globally that year. And I also follow Baldwin and the tours he's making for the Congress of Racial Equality. You know, he calls himself a witness, but he's really a political mobilizer. He's a public intellectual, and he serves as the public conscience of the entire year. I think even arguably in an even bigger way than Dr. King does that year. Even as I follow Dr. King's trajectory that over the course of the year, and Malcolm X's trajectory over the course of the year, and the Kennedy brothers' trajectory over the course of the year. So in a lot of ways, what Freedom Season shows is really the different evolution of this push for multiracial democracy and the Black freedom struggle's pivotal role in creating that 50-year consensus. And that's an imperfect consensus. 63 to 2013 features mass incarceration, systemic racism, all this stuff. But the positive is that 63 to 2013, my little dog is here just doing, I got my little tiny little dog here. Luna, our family dog, is right here. The positive is that from 63 to 2013, we get the most access that Black people, that women of color, people of color have ever had in terms of creating wealth in the country, in terms of having access to K through 12 and higher education, including at elite spaces like Harvard, in terms of becoming elected officials, in terms of attending for a time whatever schools they want to, living in the neighborhoods they want to, um, uh, being part of corporate America, being just free in a way as much as they ever have been in the history of the Republic. And we're living in a post consensus times right now, the last dozen years. Some of that's connected to Trump and MAGA, but a lot of it is connected to a disillusion of the consensus, however imperfect, that was built up in '63. So, and of course, there's a as a historian, I'm using '63 in a very specific way. Um, the heroic period of the civil rights movement begins before 1954 and Brown. There are huge freedom struggles during the Great Depression, Second World War, anti-colonialism, radical movements that are labor, that are Pan-African, that are civil rights and cultural. all throughout the 1930s and 40s. This is not to somehow say that that didn't happen. But what's so interesting is that the Cold War does create a cleavage. People like Claudia Jones, Paul Robeson, Du Bois, CLR James is deported, so is Claudia Jones. So there is a cleavage and a before and after. And so what you're seeing with 63 are the people who are able to organize in the aftermath of the wreckage of Cold War liberalism, which is really a kind of white supremacy articulated by Harry S. Truman and George Marshall and the like that really cleaves the world in two under the auspices of liberation and a fight against totalitarianism. But that really does the exact opposite when you think about Black communities and progressive communities that are trying to organize for radical democracy, radical multiracial democracy in the context of the end of the Second World War. So there's a huge betrayal of that starting in 1946, 47, 48, and that's been well documented. So I look at 63 as this huge uh, demarcating line and not just the end of something because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And that assassination doesn't happen until close to the end of the year, close to Thanksgiving, November 22nd, 1963. All right, I'll stop there, Kent.
Wow.
Mhm. Looks like Marcy is trying to say something, but she's muted.
Isn't that always the way on Zoom?
So is George.
Well, I'll ask a question. Can you say a few things about Angela Davis's uh, rise and not reign, and her rise and what she did?
Well, Angela Davis, she's not part of this story because in 63, she's an undergrad at Brandeis University in 63. So her rise, very quickly, just about Angela. I mean, Angela Davis is coming, the daughter of Sally Davis, is a red diaper baby, Birmingham, Alabama, really coming out of groups of Black activists who were in the Southern Negro Youth Congress and who had aligned themselves with both the progressive forces within the Democratic Party and people like Eleanor Roosevelt, but also aligned themselves with folks who were Marxists in the United States and globally. And so she's coming out of that tradition, um, goes to Brandeis University, goes to both the University of California system, but studies abroad with Marcuse, the very famous philosopher. And so, in a lot of ways, Angela's story is a very interesting story, but it's he's not going to come into the story until the latter half of the 1960s. So in a way, in 63, she's just an undergraduate just watching all this happen, coming from a very political background. Bettina Aptheker is a friend and really a family that's connected to the CPUSA, Communist Party United States of America, at the highest echelons. But even in 63, people like that are just um, still just observing, no matter what they might be doing on a campus, which is why I think 63 is so important. So before you get to what we've done as historians, but in pop culture too, is we turn 1968 into sort of the Marvel cinematic universe of the 60s. So you get the Black Panthers, you get Dr. King's assassination, Poor People's March, Bobby Kennedy, June 5th. Even though Kennedy doesn't die on June 5th, but the assassination attempt happens on June 5th. We sort of forget because we're not historians. And again, even people like yourselves who might have been alive in 63, I always tell folks, because I've been doing this for so long. You're not God or Jesus, so you weren't in every single room, in every single country, in every single neighborhood, and understand what happened, even though you lived through it. Like I lived through when Barack Obama ran and became president. I don't know every single thing that happened in 2008. I'd have to do research to try to analyze that. Even though absolutely I experienced it, I did stuff for PBS. I was able to meet then Senator Obama when he was on the campaign trail. So I was definitely connected and I have my memories. But to do the research, the scholarship is something different, right? So even doing something on 63, having not been born in 63, it's a piece of research that'll surprise people who even lived through that year. Because like I said, you just because you lived through a year doesn't mean um, that you know every single thing about that year, even if you're part of a movement. Because if you were part of SNCC, you weren't part of CORE, you weren't part of the NAACP, you know. So even John Lewis, the late John Lewis, only experienced 63 from a very specific perspective, right? So this is a panoramic, and that's the role of the historian in that sense.
Nice. Doug?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on having written this book. I'm about two-thirds of the way through it, and I find it not only interesting and informative, but it's a real delight to read this book.
Oh, thank you.
So congratulations for that. I have one question that I would like to ask you. On page 130 in the book, you make a comment about um, Malcolm X proposing that some form of reparations be brought to bear in the U.S. But there are no details about how reparations in Malcolm's viewpoint might work or what it might accomplish, and so forth and so on. And I wondered if you could possibly fill us in a little bit more on that, on Malcolm's views. But even more than that, could you step aside and give us your views on reparations and whether it's feasible in any way in this country of ours?
Well, I think for Malcolm, it's interesting because both King and Malcolm talk about reparations in 63. King in the I Have a Dream speech, where he says, "We come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of American um, justice or democracy is bankrupt." So it's very interesting. With Malcolm, Malcolm at the time, because he's still part of the Nation of Islam, so he's still part of the localized domestic version of Muslims, who the media erroneously calls Black Muslims. My book throughout calls them Muslims, right? Because that's not they never call themselves Black Muslims. They were absolutely African American, and they wouldn't have called themselves Negro, but they really thought of themselves as Muslims. So you've got to give them that respect. I always give everybody who've got religious beliefs the respect of what they want to be called. Um, so Malcolm at the time he's defining reparations in a way that's different from how he's going to. So in 63, he's still defining reparations in the context of Black people getting a discrete part of the United States for themselves, this kind of territorial nationalism that they are allowed to govern for themselves. And in certain ways, what's so interesting about that perspective, it connects, even though he's a nationalist, with Harry Haywood and Harry Haywood's Black Belt thesis, which becomes the CPUSA's thesis about that the five contiguous states. It's Alabama, Mississippi, some other states where they had the densest concentration of African Americans, constituted a nation within a nation, right? And that becomes the line for a time. And in certain ways, what the Nation of Islam argues is that following that logic, because people like the Republic of New Africa and other people said this too, was that the United States needed to give let Black people separate, but this was not separation in the context of the 18th and 19th century American colonization society and having to leave the United States. So this is not an effort to say, let's go to Sierra Leone and let's go to Liberia, which was an effort when we think about Martin Delany and Paul Cuffey and different that there's great scholarship and histories of that. This was the idea that Black people should be allowed to have sort of separate states. And in Malcolm's mind, it was also this articulation that they would receive support for 20, 25 years, and that would be enough to just be this independent entity. Post the Nation of Islam, he lets that go, and he's really talking about uh, global human rights, and really reparations there would be an acknowledgement of Black dignity, and acknowledging Black dignity would then converge with citizenship, because citizenship is simply the external recognition of human dignity. But Malcolm was always skeptical of the United States, and the United States' sincerity in ever recognizing Black dignity or citizenship, right? And what's so interesting about Malcolm X's rhetoric is that depending on the historical time period after his assassination, some people will feel he's very right or very wrong. So think of how people would feel about Malcolm X's rhetoric in the context of the Obama ascent in 2008, 2009. Malcolm X's skepticism towards this idea of Black dignity and citizenship seems overblown in 2008, 2009. You fast forward to 2025 and what's going on right now, his skepticism seems very, very prophetic and prescient. So that's what's very interesting about Malcolm vis-a-vis that and reparations.
Ron.
Yeah, I have a question about your impression as somebody who wasn't born in 1963 about the emotional tenor of 1963 from your point of view. You know, we just graduated, and the people you're seeing here, it was we were young and very much alive and just diving into this new world of adulthood. Our sense might have been a little self-centered, but then a classmate of ours, Todd Gitlin, wrote,
Yeah,
about the
that's right.
60s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm wondering also because decades later, I had the sad privilege of going down to Birmingham for the History Channel and doing a story about the four girls who were murdered in the bombing in 1963. And my feeling, going around the basement of the church and the graveyard was still, well after the event, that there was this sadness lingering. And so I'm just wondering what your impression of 1963 is from an emotional point of view.
Yeah, Ron, that's a great question. I just want to finish the other question about what do I think about reparations, and are they practical? I think reparations uh, are practical, even though I think you would need a national consensus. And national consensus doesn't mean unanimity. So when you think about the GI Bill, there are going to be some people who disagree with the GI Bill, who disagree with uh, uh, FHA and 30-year low interest mortgages, and who disagree with big national policy like the Affordable Care Act, but those things still get done, right? And so it's really about, I think reparations make sense at the federal, state, and local level. It makes sense vis-a-vis not as direct cash payments, but as some kind of trust that allows people to uh, uh, invest, go to school, get assets and wealth and all those different things. Um, it makes sense to do it in a way that is non-inflationary, right? So there's a way to do it. Some local municipalities and state and stuff have already done certain things, right? In Maryland, in California, and other places, but it's not impossible. Historically, we've seen it happen in the United States in terms of Japanese internment survivors. So we have that Globally, we've seen it in terms of 6 million victims of the Holocaust, Jewish victims, and 5 million other victims. So globally, we've seen different nations, including Germany and other places. So the idea of reparations is not um, it's not a wild-eyed idea. It's just that we in America, because of our own original sin of racial slavery and what, and Harvard is enmeshed in this now with free speech, but what Harvard has done with the slavery report and the research on slavery and the fears that too many descendants would bankrupt Harvard. Georgetown, UVA, everybody's implicated. The great book on this is Craig Wilder, my colleague at MIT, who's a historian, is his book Ebony and Ivy is a great book if people want to check that book out. Ebony and Ivy, about slavery, and he's got great documented evidence on there. That's it's a phenomenal book. And Harvard's own historian, who's a brilliant historian, Sven Beckert's book, Empire of Cotton, is a great book about slavery and capitalism, if people ever want to check it out. And Sven did research on like 6 or 7 continents over 20 years. It's one of the best books ever written on slavery and capitalism. So these are, just all things that you could, think about, ruminate on, right? So to speak. But Ron, that's a great question about the emotions because to me, Freedom Season in a lot of ways is my most it's one of my most personal books in the sense that I think and I've been doing research on this for really over 10 years and doing research on 63 and enmeshing in 63, but I think positively having lived through 2008 and been part of that. Um, because before 2008, when I did interviews, and I've interviewed hundreds of civil rights activists and students and different things over the years, they would always remind me of the early 60s and the Kennedy administration and how they felt during that time, especially pre-JFK assassination. And, having not until I experienced 2008, I never thought you could really be that optimistic about the country, so because I lived in a different country than they did, right? So I grew up, Ed Koch, I mean, not an inspiring figure in my opinion. Ronald Reagan, not an inspiring figure in my opinion. George Herbert Walker Bush, um, uh, Bill Clinton. I grew up in very, Sam Jackson says this in the movie Unbreakable. I grew up in very mediocre times, very mediocre times. And then Obama comes and it's like catching lightning in a bottle in terms of how you actually feel, the emotional resonance and how you feel about a kind of civic nationalism that really is multiracial. And that's not a civic nationalism connected to a distorted vision of American exceptionalism, but a kind of civic nationalism that's connected to James Baldwin's aspirational republic, which he writes about so brilliantly in The Fire Next Time. So when you look at 63, the emotions are really, really there. People really believe there's something electric going on. And I the book is divided into winter, spring, summer, and autumn, and you're able to really see the evolution. And some people like, there are books on Kennedy that are either pro-Kennedy civil rights or the book The Bystander that says, well, he didn't do anything. And I really look at his evolution in 63 and Bobby, and it's not a linear evolution. So there's a chapter called Kennedy's Finest Moment. And I think the 3 best days of the presidency are June 9th, 10th, and 11th. And I document that. The Honolulu speech, which is now a forgotten speech that I spent a lot of time on, the American University speech, which is a well-known speech, but they never link it to Black people and the struggle for Black freedom and dignity because they silo us out of American history conversations, right? And so we're not human beings, so we can't be linked to a speech that talks about ending nuclear proliferation, right? That's racist, but it's also ignorant and stupid, and it messes up our ability to tether those 3 days together. And then June 11th, which is the civil rights speech, where he says that there's a revolution happening. He says that it can't be stopped through token moves, or violent repressive police action. These are his words. He says, those who do nothing invite shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly recognize right as well as reality, right? And in that 63 speech, he also says that we preach freedom around the world, and then he pauses and says, and we mean it, right? And he's saying, and we mean it because of the paradox of uh, talking about discussing freedom globally, like he's going to do in Bonn and Berlin later that month, and having Bull Connor and German Shepherds and fire hoses, not just in Birmingham, but I document Savannah, Greenwood, downtown Brooklyn, New York, California. This is happening everywhere. So the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor moment of 2020, it is 63, millions of people in the street, thousands of demonstrations, and really a crisis at hand, which the president talks about. And a few hours later, Medgar Evers is assassinated, right? And one of the things that Freedom Season does is show you Medgar Evers' activism before his assassination, right? So you see Jimmy Baldwin and Medgar Evers, James Meredith in Mississippi on New Year's Day of 63, and how these things are unfolding. Yeah. So I think it's a hugely emotionally resonant year. I think it's a triumphant year, in spite of the tragedies, right? In spite of the tragedies, there's a huge spirit of hope. And I show Howard Zinn and some of Howard Zinn's activism, Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Gloria Richardson. But I also show Joan Trumpauer, who's the SNCC activist, who's one of the only white students at Tougaloo University. John Salter, who's white and Native American, and sort of being beaten on lunch counters in 63. So it's really an extraordinary story when you slow it down and you don't have to move and say, oh, here's what happened the following year, right? So that's what was so important to me about doing the book, because I think 63 is the ball game, and you needed to slow it down and just have a whole narrative. And really, the book could have been twice as long as my manuscript was twice as long initially. I wish it would have been the 200 and something thousand words. This is about 140,000 words, but I think the year deserves that. Obviously, it's a fight with the publisher over all this, but yeah.
Alden.
Thank you.
You just mentioned Medgar Evers, and I a couple of things about Medgar Evers. I'm probably the only person here who actually met Medgar Evers, and as many of you know, his assassination happened on our graduation day, and I can remember where I was in Dunster House when I heard on the radio that he'd been murdered.
And how did you meet him?
Well, I spent a year in Germany in school before I came to Harvard, and then my German roommate came over in my sophomore year, and we traveled a little bit. And I said, Frida, you really need to see, if you want to see the U.S., you need to see the South. And so we went down to Atlanta and then hitchhiked over to Mississippi. And just sort of, we marched in and happened to talk to Governor Ross Barnett. And we also went to the NAA headquarters, and that's where we met Medgar Evers.
So you went to Masonic Temple downtown Jackson.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yep.
And then also to Tougaloo for dinner, and we met some other people. It was an interesting time. But anyway, could you say a little bit more about Medgar Evers and in this context?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most exciting parts of the book was being able to talk about Medgar Evers, who's born in 1925 in Decatur, Mississippi, same age as Malcolm X. One thing, everybody's just so young here. Jimmy Baldwin's 38, Medgar Evers is 37, Bobby Kennedy is 37, Baldwin is 38, President Kennedy is 45, 46. Everybody's just incredibly young, which is very, very interesting to write about. And in addition to the students and the activists, but Medgar Evers is really the most important activist alive in Mississippi. He's the field secretary for the Jackson for the Mississippi NAACP. Him and Aaron Henry are the dynamic 1-2 punch. But Medgar Evers is somebody who, alongside his wife Merle and their three children who are 9, 8, and 3, James Van Dyke and Rena Denise, and Daryl Kenyatta. He names the middle name of his son, Daryl, his firstborn, is after Jomo Kenyatta, the first prime minister and president of Kenya. So Medgar Evers is a really fascinating, interesting figure who is the person in the NAACP who highlights the violence that's happening in Mississippi. He's the person who helps bring national attention to Emmett Till's lynching, which had happened on August 28th, 1955. A hugely courageous and stalwart activist who's a former military veteran who's part of the Red Ball Express in the Second World War, uh, former football player, um, uh, somebody who exudes a kind of rectitude and seriousness and discipline that imbues other people around him with real deep courage. I show how he's being profiled in national magazines and newspapers before his assassination, including the New York Times. And I also get deep into the May speech that he gives on television in Jackson, where the mayor, Alan Thompson, had given a speech saying everything was great in terms of race relations in Jackson, and that the NAACP were outside agitators, that old trope. And Medgar Evers demanded equal time, and he receives it. And he gives really one of the most extraordinary speeches in the whole annals of the civil rights movement, where he talks about his experience in Jackson, in his experience in Mississippi. He talks about being um, part of a group of Black people, and the Evers family has been in Mississippi since before Reconstruction, and he's not an outside agitator. He talks about Africa and the anti-colonial movements that are happening in the Congo, and says that there's more freedom happening at a better pace in the Congo than in Mississippi, but he's going to change and transform that. But he uses specific language. He says that he fought against, and this is his words, Hitlerism and fascism overseas to free America and free democracy and to free the world. And he's going to do the same in Mississippi. Truly, truly extraordinary. So Medgar Evers is somebody who gives you chills. There should be movies about Medgar Evers and miniseries about Medgar Evers. He's this unbelievable American hero who we still sort of spend too little time on, and we also still just view him as a martyr. So in my book, he's alive through the first big bulk of the book, and I wanted us to see and to feel him and the kind of person he was, who students admired him, James Baldwin admired him, Martin Luther King Jr. admired him, was crying at his funeral, wanted to speak, but Roy Wilkins wouldn't let him because Roy
But
Wilkins.
Wilkins and Evers had some confrontations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But Evers was also a military veteran, so he listened to chain of command, but they did. He did. I mean, right before Evers dies is the closest him and Wilkins become, because Wilkins, for a short period of time, is interested in direct action and gets arrested on June 1st, June 2nd in Jackson, Mississippi. So there's a short period of time where Jackson, Mississippi threatens to become another Birmingham. There are two sites of Mississippi. Mississippi does not explode completely until 64 with Freedom Summer, but in the spring of 63, Greenwood and Jackson have separate but also converging movements that for a time threaten to sort of grip the imagination of the entire nation. Birmingham is going to be the city that does, but the movement in Jackson gets more cohesion because of Medgar Evers, and then of course because of his assassination, which becomes really global in scope. So one of the things I show too is the way in which that assassination, and really post Medgar's assassination, you start to see with the Walk for Freedom, you start to see it at the March on Washington, where there are signs and eulogies for him everywhere, right? Like he becomes this living symbol of the movement in a very poignant way, and he becomes part of that emotion that Ron was talking about too, And there becomes a crest because a week after his assassination, Kennedy sends the 1963 Civil Rights Act to Congress, right? And that same day he sends it to Congress, he meets up with Myrlie and two of her children and Charles Evers and gives them a signed copy of the 1963 Civil Rights Act and some other mementos. And then 3 days later, he meets up with King privately and with civil rights leaders at the White House before flying to Bonn and Berlin. And then the next day, on June 23rd, King leads what is then the biggest civil rights demonstration in American history, over 125,000 people in Detroit on June 23rd, the Walk for Freedom, that Barry Gordy, the Motown founder, turns into a record. He releases King's first version of I Have a Dream, and I actually have that record downstairs.
Wow. Wow. John, do you have a question? Woodford.
No, I forgot what I was going to say. I have to think about it again. It was so fascinating to see this sort of a history. I mean, it's a way to explore so many issues by focus. I mean, I do think that isolating a year, whether 1499 or 15 or they have various that are they're book projects in a way. So I don't know whether we can really, there are projects in which something is claimed about a certain year and it helps illuminate way beyond the year it's focused on. I don't know whether we really, can grasp the significance of the arcs, the ups and downs. I mean, as Richard warned, and his admonition about taking what someone says at a certain time, and if they, if you think what was said in 1963 and 4 about what was going to happen in the United States and when, and we documented the rosier resistance, revolutionary statements, and then look to see what happened 15, 20, 25, 30 years later, we we often seen that events didn't pan out the way we might have thought in our golden period. It's things are so much more difficult in real life to achieve uh, these goals and these objectives. But I think that yeah, Medgar Evers. But you could just so what if your focus with them was Fannie Lou Hamer? I mean, you could go and you could explore another whole similarly depth and range of personality and influence. So I think the good thing about this is that perhaps this book will get in the hands of many younger people today and in high schools and colleges when they're told that they won't be able to have any access to history of this sort, and they'll actually uh, get the history and pursue so many of the things that you have described here. Any line of inquiry by a student or a class will be very rich. So I'm very happy that you've made it, this is a kind of like a bombshell book.
And Fannie Lou Hamer is in here. She's
Oh,
in here on her way back from being beaten in Winona, Mississippi, by both law enforcement and black trustees who they forced to beat her. So I show that as well. Lorraine Hansberry is deeply in here as well, who's the playwright, international feminist, and a mentor to James Baldwin politically. Because Lorraine Hansberry, there was an earlier question about Angela Davis. She's that before Angela. She's she's a Marxist. She's influenced by people like Angela Davis's parents, and she is mentored by Paul Robeson. She's a contemporary of people like John Oliver Killens, and she's more political than Baldwin initially. By 63, Baldwin is absolutely coming into his own, but 15 years earlier, Baldwin had been, Baldwin had been a Cold War liberal. Baldwin
mhm.
somebody who was nurtured by the Partisan Review and nurtured by a line of inquiry that decried the social realism of Richard Wright and Ann Petrie. Ann Petrie's The Street, Richard Wright's Native Son, and Uncle Tom's Children and Black Boy, and they didn't want to celebrate black writers. They were just interested in writers who happened to be black. And so the Ellisonian model of a kind of rugged individualism that is praised by the Saul Bellows and praised by the literary establishment. That's what Baldwin initially, that's who he initially is. And he turns into something different. So they feel very much betrayed by the Jimmy Baldwin of the Fire next time.
What year
Because
was it when Baldwin, when Lorraine Hansberry and Baldwin and the others went to meet with Bobby Kennedy? When what year
that's
was
in
that?
Freedom Season. That's May 24th of 63.
Oh, okay, because she really laid it out her greatness in that encounter. You might
Yes.
tell about it.
Okay, yeah. So there's going to be a summit. The summit is when Bobby Kennedy has initially it starts with Bobby Kennedy requesting a breakfast with James Baldwin at his mansion in McLean, Virginia, which is called Hickory Hill. And in certain ways, Baldwin becomes this massive celebrity in '63. Bobby Kennedy is already a celebrity. And one thing to remember too is people were touting Bobby as president in '68 while his brother was alive. So sometimes people lose the thread and make an argument that he only wants to be president because of Kennedy's assassination, JFK. That's not true. People are touting the attorney general in 1963. Look magazine, Time, Newsweek, if people want to go check these things out, they're saying that Bobby's going to run for president in '68 against Lyndon Johnson. They're saying that, so it's interesting the foreshadowing, and obviously that kind of stuff happens in a much, more complicated way because of the president's assassination. But Bobby invites Jimmy Baldwin to his home, and Baldwin and him over breakfast discuss who Baldwin could gather for a meeting because Bobby's concerned about not just racial violence in the South, but racial violence in the urban North too. And so um, it's a very pleasant breakfast that transforms into something else by the time of the meeting. It's so pleasant that Jimmy comes to the house the same week that Time magazine has placed him on the cover. And Bobby's Negro chauffeur picks Jimmy up, and Bobby's Negro maid asks for an autographed copy. So he autographs her copy of Time magazine at the white attorney general who's got the Negro chauffeur and Negro maids mansion in Hickory Hill, Virginia. So that's how you know how things were, how crazy um, things were. And Bobby doesn't understand sort of the irony, the racial politics of this too. The black chauffeur picking him up, the black maid, right? He
Decent job.
yeah, but he's feeling he's the champion of the people still, right? And the meeting they have the next day disabuses him of that because Baldwin brings Lorraine Hansberry, Lena Horne, Harry Belafonte, a civil rights activist named Jerome Smith, who's really important, 25 years old, core activist, Congress of Racial Equality from Louisiana, who, like John Lewis, has had his head busted in, experienced all kinds of unspeakable violence. And Kenneth Clark, the famous black psychologist, is there. There's just a whole group of people there, and they proceed over 3 hours to disabuse Bobby Kennedy, who's only there with Burke Marshall, who's his aide, in terms of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. They disabuse Bobby Kennedy of this kind of fantasy that he has that the Kennedy administration is doing everything they can to support the struggle for Black dignity and citizenship. And it really becomes a back and forth with Bobby for the first time having a group of mostly Black. There's a couple of white people in there, including the actor Rip Torn, who's one of Jimmy Baldwin's best friends. If I grew up on, and I love pop culture, so Rip Torn, and one of his great friends too is Shelley Winters. And we remember the great actress Shelley Winters, not just of the Poseidon adventure, but of she's the doomed bride of Montgomery Clift in a play.
Right.
Sun.
Business.
Yeah, right. And which is really based on Theodore Dreiser's American Tragedy. So it's really, really interesting that
Well,
meeting.
Lorraine opens a can of whip ass on him.
Oh, she does. She
Yeah.
does. but Baldwin and them do too. But Lorraine,
Yeah.
she definitely says that there's a picture in the New York Times, not on the front cover, but in the 20s, of a black woman being with police putting a knee to the back of a black woman. It's really, this is 63, and it's there. You all can check. And she says how she fears for the soul of a nation where that picture can happen, where that could happen to this black woman, and it's sort of business as usual. And then she sort of departs, and sort of announces the meeting is over. So that's a really pivotal moment, that May 24th moment. And Bobby Kennedy, the punchline here is that Kennedy's evolution is really uneven because Clarence Jones, Martin King's attorney, is there, and Kennedy uh, puts a FBI jacket on everybody who's at the meeting, including Baldwin. So because of that meeting, Clarence Jones's phone is wiretapped, and it's because of the May 24th Jimmy Baldwin meeting that J. Edgar Hoover finds out about King's extramarital affairs through the Clarence Jones wiretap, all approved by Bobby Kennedy. And this is what people, I look at JFK and Bobby, just the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's not a demonization, but you want to tell the truth about them, where their evolution is uneven. So even the Bobby of the 82-day run for presidency in 68, this is part of him. This is part of who he is, right? And we have to grow up and be mature enough to understand that, right? And JFK does extraordinary things that year. But once September 15th happens and the 6 black children are murdered, he doesn't go to any of their funerals. And Dr. King asks him, pleads with him to go, right? So it's morally reprehensible, politically indefensible, but JFK is worried about 64. He doesn't know he's going to die in November 22nd. He's worried about 64, and he's worried that the backlash that really comes from the South in 68 is going to happen to him in 64. And I've got great phone conversations with JFK, different Southern politicians, worrying about this, including there were efforts in 63 by the far right wing. They didn't come to anything, but they were talking about faithless electors in 63. They were talking about putting the presidency in the House of Representatives in 63 for the next year. There were plots to, there was a point where Kennedy tells LBJ that even if we lose all the states, the 2 states we're going to win are Texas and Massachusetts. So that's where the whole notion that he was going to throw LBJ overboard, that's not true. That's not true. They were in the saddle together through the bitter end, even as he was upset that he had to visit Texas because he felt LBJ should have handled that where there was no crisis in the Texas Democratic Party. And Pierre Salinger is warned, and I have that in here too. They're warned for the president not to go to Dallas, not to go to Texas, because there's been so much right-wing violence, including crowds of right-wing Bircherites trying to um, beat the crap out of Adlai Stevenson. So it was a bad visit. It's a tone deaf visit, just so we know. But it's really interesting in terms of to see that year and how it plays out, and their evolutions are never it's not linear. So people have these high points and low points, and sometimes they grow, but it's not in the order that you want.
Ham.
Yeah. I appreciate your picking up on 1963, and you're right how oblivious we can be I may have been while it was happening in a lot of ways. And I also wanted to say that I listened to your I listened to your book on Audible, and I appreciated that you read your own book, and that the tempo of it changed and got a lot more intense as it went along, and that's just a very good way to experience your book.
No, thank you, Hampton.
Doug, you have a last question?
Yeah, or maybe the last two quick ones. So I was recently in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I had the impression down there that I was never quite clear uh, whether American Indians have really been fully accepted as, quote, Americans in spite of their ancient history in this continent and so forth. And I wondered, what your thoughts about American Indians might be, and whether you think that they are to what extent do they fit in with the discussions we've been talking about, kind of racism and so forth and so on, as opposed to broader ways of thinking about individuals in the context of America? And then the second thing, maybe is very quick, is could you comment, please, about why it is that so many of America's uh, marvelous uh, book writers have spent so much time in Paris?
That's a great question. Paris is so the Native American question, yeah, they're a big part of this. And I talk about there's a June 15th rally in DC outside of Bobby Kennedy's State Department office where the Washington Post and others note the presence of Asian Americans and Native Americans at these demonstrations. So you're seeing a cresting um, tide in 63, I would argue, of really multiracial democracy and the coalitions that somebody like King is going to be trying to push in an even deeper way by 67, 68 with the Poor People's Campaign. So I do think that one of the interesting aspects of the Black freedom struggle is the capaciousness and the rainbow aspect. It's Fred Hampton of the Panthers who came up with that rainbow radicalism, rainbow coalition that then Jesse Jackson popularizes in 84. But we see it in 63. So Native peoples are going to be impacted by the civil rights struggle, are going to, and we see everything from, efforts to take over Alcatraz to the rise of the American Indian movement in the late 60s, but even before. I mean, there's a great book by Tom Guillermo called Divisions about that looks at race in the Second World War, including Native American soldiers and indigenous soldiers and how they were treated and how they were inspired by how African Americans tried to at times deal with how they were treated during the Second World War by the U.S. military. Um, Paris is interesting because post-war Paris uh, becomes a refuge for a lot of writers. One, because of the strength of the American dollar. Two, because really very quickly after the Second World War, uh, there is a recrudence of very kind of vicious and overt racism and racial segregation that Jimmy Baldwin is victimized by when he's working in war industries in New Jersey circa 1946, 47. So very quickly after the Second World War ends, there are real and people here were alive during 63. I don't know how well you remember 45, 46, but there's going to be shortages, clothing shortages and other supply shortages in 46. And there's going to be um, really a diminishing of the workforce when you think about 46, 47 because certain industries don't need quite as many people and GIs are returning home. There's going to be fierce competition over jobs and over resources at home as the war is winding down. And there's going to be a lot of Black and other historically marginalized, oppressed groups and people who are writers and very quickly see they need to get out. They need to get out of the United States, and they utilize um, uh, the the openings that are happening elsewhere, especially in Paris. And of course, Paris has a long history, whether we're thinking about Josephine Baker or we're thinking about the so-called lost generation of different writers sort of glamorizing Paris during World War One and after, Simone de Beauvoir, Hemingway, of course. There's just a lot of there's a romance there that Baldwin was attracted to. Richard Wright was there, of course, and had decamped the United States for Paris during the 1940s and felt it was a more hospitable place for interracial friendships and interracial intimacy. People were interracially married, like Wright was, had children who were biracial, mixed race children. And Baldwin goes across the color line sexually as well, even as Baldwin is queer. So Paris is a place, I would argue a lot less so now in 2025, but in 1948, where there's going to be an ability to recognize Black queer genius in ways that are demonstrably not evident in the United States. Yeah.
But what about you? Your parents' union 1199 has been a great organization. Have you written about that, or do you know of any great history of that trade union?
I don't know if there's a great history of 1199 per se. I've written about them in the context of the 1960s and have done some other stuff for them because that was the union of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. 1199. So that's the hospital workers union, very multiracial, one of the biggest unions that ever had the first Black woman president, Doris Turner, in the 1980s. And so the 1199 was sort of like, is the American labor force future when you think about the 1960s, because it's going to become heavily people of color, heavily women working in these industries, and not your usual suspect, like sort of like it's not the Teamsters in that sense. And the Teamsters are about to be displaced by AI anyway, like everybody, and that's coming in the next 15 years if people don't realize like that quickly.
Yeah. 1199 could throw a tremendous strike if it ever got to that.
Oh no, and it has. I mean,
Yeah.
it has, and that's how my mom we got health bennies. That's how we started to go see the dentist after a while, right? Yeah, mom was taking me and my brother and saying, "Hey, we're going to the dentist," and we were saying, "Hey, this doesn't usually happen. Why? Why?" It's like, well, that last strike, we got dental care. Hallelujah, we got dental care. So that's why, So I'm probably the biggest labor advocate that you'll ever meet because I know what labor solidarity actually gives you, and it's very, very unbelievably important. I tell professors all the time, professors, I'm part of AAUP. A lot of professors aren't because professors are from such cushy backgrounds that they don't know about solidarity. They really don't. Like if you're in solidarity with folks to get better benefits and resources, that is much different from allyship. The reason why after, and I've got to get out of here, so I'll leave you with this. The reason why George Floyd and everything, nobody stayed behind is because everybody was offering allyship. And as somebody who's coming from a labor background, which you always need, it's not allies, you need solidarity. And the reason why my mom showed up on picket lines, you need to show up and show your solidarity. So solidarity isn't that you're back home in Queens and everybody's marching in Manhattan. Solidarity is we take 3 different trains to get to 92nd Street and we stay on the picket line all day, every day while the strike happens. That's solidarity.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, tenured professors are losing their jobs now, so the AAUP is going to have to step up.
And the AAUP we've been doing well. But like I said, we need more membership. We need more membership. So those of us who are members and you try to proselytize and you can only do so much because you need people to be CLR James called it self-activity, right? You need people to be self-active for themselves and in solidarity with others, self-determination, right? And we just saw it at the No Kings demonstrations. If we want anything to change, you need solidarity. And solidarity for those of us who are able-bodied, those of us who are disabled, who can, irrespective of your identity, it's showing up. It's showing up. And it's not just voting. Voting is the last aspect of solidarity. I'm all for the vote, but people obsess over the vote. And The reason why we need people on school boards, the reason why you need to show up to city council meetings and state assembly meetings, it's solidarity. The vote is the last, like once you get people to have solidarity, of course they're all going to vote. You see what I'm saying? The vote is the last arrow in your quiver. It's not the first, it's the last thing. You're supposed to be, and this is what 63 shows you, is that if you have enough solidarity across the board, you're going to compel and coerce and you're going to change things, even though people don't want things to change, especially those in power. And the change isn't going to happen on your terms. And that's why it's so frustrating. That's why democracy is very, very frustrating, because it's not authoritarianism. It's not a dictatorship. It's not fascism where you can predict the outcome, right? So when you rig the elections, you can predict the outcome. Democracy is rough and tumble, and you lose. You lose arguments. You lose. And even when you win, it doesn't turn out the way you might have imagined, but it's the best system that we've ever been able to invent.
Hopefully, when you write your book about 2025, you'll show a resurgence of solidarity.
Yeah.
We're seeing it. We actually are, but the media is not reporting it, but we're seeing it. You just saw New York City's primary election, and there's so much happening where people are in the streets, and people now completely distrust the media, which is its own real critically dangerous thing. But there is solidarity happening, including labor, but across labor. But if we're ever going to change things, we need labor solidarity. People have to know that labor is a big part, because we all work and we have to all consider ourselves part of that labor solidarity, including my friend here on this call who said they were doing trust and estates and big time finance. That's labor, Nick, right? But you got to be in solidarity with people who do different kinds of labor, right? Because we're all laboring. We're all laboring, including the people who are, they feel they're the smartest person in the room, the scientists. It's all labor, right? Just like the people who clean our lawns and prepare our foods, but we don't think of it that way. And we're not educated to at least consider it that way, because we want education, not indoctrination, but we should at least allow students to say, hey, maybe my labor is connected to this other kind of labor, right? Just like golf as a sport is connected to track and field and NBA and NFL, it's still a very, very taxing sport. If anybody's ever played 18 holes of golf, it's not easy, and you get very frustrated very quickly, right? So it's still a sport, right? It's still a sport, right? But people don't think of it that way, right? Yeah.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. It's been really great.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Professor Peniel Joseph from the University of Texas at Austin. His new book is titled Freedom Season: How 1963 Transformed America's Civil Rights Revolution. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I will talk to you again next week. I'm Kent Garrett.